Hi, my name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 28, and I live in Denver, Colorado. If stories about family and the quiet ways love shows up mean something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd stick around. Tap subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. Today's story is called Dad Was Criticized for Missing My Birth, but the truth was he was donating blood to save Mom and me. You think a father who wasn't there when his daughter was born is a villain. I did too. For years, I fed on that line the way a small town feeds on rumor. Quickly, hungrily, and without much chewing. People didn't say it to my face, not at first. They said it to each other, just loud enough for it to become the air I breathed. At the grocery store, between the apples and the price-cut bread. At church, in the friendly hush after the hymn. At birthday parties where adults stood under strings of paper lanterns and poured one more cup of lemonade before saying, "Well, you know Michael wasn't even there when Sarah came. Can you imagine?" I could imagine. I imagined every version that would make me angry. He couldn't stomach the blood. He had something better to do. He was afraid. The imagination is cruel that way. It fills holes with the sharpest objects it can find. Ask yourself, when you don't know the whole story, do you reach for patience or for a weapon? If you're like me, you reach for what helps you stand taller in the mirror. Anger has a way of adding inches. My father's name is Michael Bennett. He is the kind of man who wears the same canvas jacket until the cuffs shine like old coins. He is not a talker. Some men put their love into speeches. My father put his into straight rows of garden beans, of nails in a board, of receipts he folded into an envelope labeled property tax. He is a quiet man, which is the kind people call stubborn when they disagree with him and dependable when they need him. He drove a white pickup with a dent in the passenger door I used to trace with my finger as a kid, like reading Braille. When he laughed, he tilted his head first, as if he were listening for permission. Growing up, I learned the story of my birth from everyone except the two people who were there. My mother, Linda, would change the subject, not unkindly, just carefully. "It was a long night," she'd say, pressing her palm to my forehead as if a memory were a fever she could cool. "You were a stubborn little thing. You didn't want to meet the world." I took that as a compliment at 8 and a character flaw at 15. The town carried a different version. It wasn't a long night, it was a long absence. He left her, a woman once whispered at a block party like a dare. She needed him, and he was nowhere. I was standing 3 feet away, holding a paper plate that folded under the weight of potato salad. When I turned, the woman pinched my cheek, because sometimes people decorate their worst sentences with a smile. I smiled back because children survive by pretending not to hear. You, reading this, have you ever felt like your house had 2 languages? The one you spoke at the dinner table, and the one everyone else spoke about your family when you weren't invited. We ate at 6:30, like a rule. My father would come in from the garage washed to the wrists, hands still smelling faintly of oil. He'd set down his fork to listen when I talked about school, the way some people set down a book to remember their place. Sometimes when I caught him looking, there was a softness in his eyes that embarrassed me. I wanted something bigger than softness. I wanted answers the size of the ache gossip had built inside me. In middle school, my best friend Nora asked, "Do you ever wish your dad was, I don't know, more like the other dads?" We were sitting on the curb, knees knobby and scabbed, watching the streetlights blink awake. "They seem so into it," she said. "Like the videos of the delivery room, the tears, the whole thing." I shrugged, a motion I perfected in adolescence, and said, "He wasn't into it." It was a cheap line, and I bought it because it cost me nothing in the moment. It cost me later. There are pictures from my first day of kindergarten. My mother kneels to tie my shoe. My father stands behind the camera. I can tell by what the picture chooses to love. The crooked bow on my sneaker, the way my hair escapes its barrette like it wants to grow toward the light. He never took pictures of himself. He took pictures of what he couldn't keep. Back then, I didn't understand that a man can be steady and still carry one secret that splinters the floorboards under every step. In high school, the rumor had aged but not faded. People don't update old stories. They preserve them in the amber of their own bias. A teacher, well-meaning, once said, "You're so resilient, Sarah. Kids without involved fathers often struggle." I thought of the lunches he packed. The banana always speckled just right, the note on the napkin that said, "You've got this, Dad." I thought of the way he waited in the parking lot after late games, headlights cutting a safe path through the drizzle. I said nothing. The thing about being misunderstood is you start misunderstanding yourself to match. I asked my mother only once, really asked. I was 16 and mean with the hunger to know. We were washing dishes. The window cracked to let out steam and summer. Why wasn't he there? I asked, and the question dropped into the sink, loud as silverware. She turned off the water. "It was complicated," she said, drying her hands on a towel already damp with other explanations. "He did what he thought he had to." I waited for more, but she was already stacking plates, building a tower of silence. I stormed out because teenagers major in exits. Later that night, my father knocked on my door and said, "We good?" I said, "Sure," in the tone that means anything but. He nodded, and I hated him for accepting it. Isn't it strange how we punish people for not reading the pages we refuse to hand them? You could say I grew up in a house with 3 people and a shadow. The shadow ate with us. It rode in the back seat to the dentist. It sat on the sofa between us during movies, where my father always fell asleep halfway through, his head tilted back, his mouth open like he was trying to catch something falling from the ceiling. I kept a list in my head of the ways he failed me, like beads on a string I fingered when I needed to feel righteous. Missed birth. Never explains. Too quiet. Too stubborn. In time, the list replaced the man. But there were other lists, the kind you don't write because they indict you, too. The morning he fixed the neighbor's tire in February without being asked. The summer he drove my friend home at midnight because her date turned mean and she had no one else to call. The winter he spent 3 weekends under our sink, replacing a pipe that didn't want to be replaced, just so we could afford my AP exam fees. I never told those stories. We don't retell what makes our anger wobble. Once, when I was 9, I found a brown envelope at the back of the hallway closet. Inside were things that looked like pieces from a life I hadn't been introduced to properly. A hospital visitor badge, faded. A receipt from the cafeteria with a coffee and 2 bagels circled in pen. And a Polaroid of my mother in a hospital bed, hair slicked to her forehead, smiling the way people smile when they've survived a storm they don't want to name. My father's hand was in the corner of the frame, a fingertip caught like a mistake. I carried the envelope to the kitchen, but by the time I turned the corner, it felt like contraband in my chest. I put it back. I've wondered since how many truths I returned to closets because I liked the shape of my grievance better than the weight of an answer. Do you have a grievance like that? Something you polish until it gleams, because gleaming hurts less than admitting you've been wrong. If you do, hold it up to the light. See how it throws back only what you give it. We lived with Colorado seasons, bright and abrupt. Spring was a rumor, summer a declaration, winter an occupation. When the wind pushed through our street, you could hear the chain on our flagpole click like teeth. On Sunday afternoons, Dad and I would drive to Red Rocks and not talk very much. He walked slower on the way up and faster on the way down. I tried to match him and failed, so our steps fell out of rhythm. That's how it felt at home, too. Not wrong, exactly, just out of step. He'd say, "Proud of you, kid," after every report card, and I'd say, "Thanks," and both of us would feel the word but hovering like a thunderhead. When I left for college, he packed the truck as if I were leaving for a frontier that required extra socks and hand tools. He stood in my dorm room doorway with the look of a man who wanted to warn me about something that couldn't be said in a sentence. "You'll do fine," he said. Then he added, "Call your mother." He didn't say, "Call me," and I didn't ask him why. We both obeyed the old choreography, step close, step back, bow out. It's funny what people choose as the definitive proof of character. For some, it's a wedding toast. For others, it's the way you tip a waiter. For my father, they chose my birthday. He failed the test in the eyes of people who prefer tests to lives. I tell you this not to make you angry on my behalf, but to ask, what single day have you let define someone else, or you? What ceremony did you think proved a person's worth? And what if that ceremony stole the light from everything before and after it? If this were a different kind of story, I'd tell you I confronted him at Thanksgiving, that the truth burst out in front of the turkey like a magic trick, applause all around. But this is a story about a quiet man and the slow turn of a daughter's heart. It begins, as it must, with the wound, my wound, and the echo it made in our house. The echo lasted 28 years, loud enough to drown out the good. There is one night I can't stop replaying. I was 11, feverish, the kind of fever that bends time. My mother paced the hallway, counting pills and hours. My father sat on the edge of my bed and read the instructions on the bottle out loud, as if the words themselves could anchor me back to shore. "Every 6 hours," he murmured, the way you might repeat a prayer you're not sure you still believe. At some point I woke to his hand on my forehead. His palm was cool. He was humming, tuneless, a man with no melody left except the promise to stay. But even then, a thought cut through the fog. You weren't there when I arrived. I wish I could go back and kneel beside that bed and tell the girl the truth she didn't yet know. That sometimes the most faithful presence will be accused of absence, and the only way to bear it is to love bigger than the accusation. I won't pretend I was brave. I carried my anger to adulthood the way you carry a backpack you've outgrown, straps digging into your shoulders, pockets full of things you don't need but can't bring yourself to throw away. When I moved into my first apartment, Dad helped me assemble a bookshelf. He turned the instructions sideways, then upside down, then ignored them. "Some things you just know," he said. "You feel your way through." I wanted to say, "Then why didn't you feel your way to the delivery room?" Instead, I fetched him a glass of water, watched the way his hands steadied once the shelf took shape, and said nothing. This is where Chapter 1 leaves us, in a kitchen with a stack of clean plates and unspoken questions, in a pickup with the dented door and a father who drives you home even when you act like you'd rather walk, in a town that keeps score by the wrong numbers. My father missed my birth. That's the headline that kept running. The truth, the one I did not have yet, was still in the layout stage, waiting for its chance to go to print. If you've ever loved someone and judged them in the same breath, I hope you'll stay with me. Because the night I finally found the first proof, thin as paper and heavy as a life, everything I thought I knew about my father shifted, quietly at first, like a house settling after a storm. And the echo that had rattled our walls for decades began to fade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, all you need to know is this. A story can be wrong for a very long time and still feel right. And a man can spend years paying a price he never tried to avoid because he decided the debt was worth it. If any of this sounds familiar, if there's a rumor in your life you've let grow taller than the person it's about, don't go anywhere. There's more to tell, and I promise it will make you look at your own stories differently. They say every family has its ghosts. Ours didn't rattle chains in the attic or whisper through the walls. Our ghost was quieter, more insidious. It lived in pauses, in the hush that fell whenever my birth was mentioned. Growing up, I didn't notice it right away. Children accept silence the way they accept gravity, it simply is. But the older I became, the louder that silence grew. By the time I was 12, it was deafening. It wasn't just what people in town said, it was how they said it. Their tone was soft enough to pretend it wasn't gossip, sharp enough to leave a scratch. "Poor Linda," they murmured, meaning my mother. She was all alone in the delivery room, Can you imagine what kind of man does that? I never asked them to stop. I just let the words sink into me the way wood soaks up rain. I wish I could tell you I confronted my father then. I didn't. Children rarely confront. We absorb. And I absorbed everything, every half-smile, every lifted eyebrow, every whispered pity. I carried it like a stone in my pocket, heavy and always there. At school, it became a weapon. Kids can be cruel not because they are evil, but because cruelty is a shortcut to power. One boy in 7th grade, Marcus, I still remember, shouted across the cafeteria, "Hey, Sarah, did your dad skip your birthday too?" His friends laughed. I laughed too, the way you do when your only defense is pretending the arrow didn't hit. But it did. It always did. That night I went home and slammed my bedroom door so hard the frame cracked. My mother tapped lightly, asked if I was okay. I told her I had too much homework. She accepted it, maybe relieved not to be asked about the past. And my father, he knocked once, waited for an answer that never came and walked away. That was his way. He was a man who respected closed doors even when what was behind them was a bleeding child. By high school, the silence between us had become a canyon. He drove me to soccer games, sat in the stands, cheered when I scored. He made sure my car ran smoothly, that I never left the driveway without enough gas. He was present in every way that counted, except the one that haunted me most. And because he wouldn't speak of it, I couldn't see any of the other ways. Sometimes I'd watch him across the dinner table. He'd fold his napkin precisely, cut his meat into neat squares. His hands were large, scarred from years at the machine shop. I'd imagine those hands fidgeting nervously outside a delivery room, unwilling to face the mess of birth. The image disgusted me. I mistook restraint for cowardice, silence for shame. There was one evening in particular. I was 15, sullen and sharp, the way teenagers often are. My mother had gone to bed early with a headache. I found my father in the garage, bent over the hood of his truck. The air smelled of oil and metal. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, and asked, "Why weren't you there?" He didn't look up. He wiped his hands on a rag, studied the engine like it held the only answer he was allowed to give. After a long pause, he said, "Not every story is for telling." It infuriated me. "That's not an answer," I snapped. He finally met my eyes. There was something there, something raw, almost pleading, but he only shook his head. "Someday, maybe you'll understand." I stormed off, convinced he was protecting himself, not me. In truth, he was protecting both of us, but I wouldn't learn that for years. You might think I hated him then. I didn't. Love is more complicated than that. It was a mix, anger, admiration, confusion, all braided together until I couldn't separate one strand from another. He was the man who fixed my science project at midnight, who drove across town to buy the exact notebook I wanted, who stood at the back of every awards ceremony. But he was also the man who had abandoned me on the first day of my life, or so I thought. And so, the wound deepened. College only made it worse. Away from home, I discovered that other families told stories freely. My roommate at freshman orientation could recount every detail of her birth, her father's tears, the jokes the doctor made, the exact moment her parents realized they were in it together. Her story was a necklace she wore proudly, every bead polished. I listened, smiled politely, and when she asked about mine, I shrugged. My dad wasn't there. The words came easier than I expected, like a script I'd memorized, and every time I repeated it, the canyon between my father and me widened. Still, he never corrected me. He called every Sunday, asked about classes, sent care packages with snacks I hadn't realized I missed. He visited twice, sat through my lectures, beamed when professors praised my essays. And yet, he never once said why he hadn't been there that day. Looking back, I see the irony. I accused him of absence while I was the one absent in spirit. I withheld myself, kept him at arm's length. Love cannot thrive at arm's length. It needs closeness, even if closeness hurts. But I didn't know that yet. Instead, I collected grievances like trophies. I told friends, boyfriends, anyone who'd listen. Yeah, my dad wasn't there when I was born. Sometimes they gasped, sometimes they pitied me, sometimes they shrugged. No matter the reaction, it fed the story I carried like gospel. The truth was waiting, quiet as always, in a stack of papers in a box in the attic. I wouldn't find it until years later. Until then, I lived under the weight of silence and rumor, and so did he. By sophomore year of high school, the story of my father's absence had grown into a kind of myth around me. People didn't tell it cruelly anymore. They told it knowingly, as if it explained something about me. "She's strong," a teacher would remark. She had to be, with the way things started. Started. That word always hit me like a slap, as though my life had been launched off the wrong foot because my father had not stood at the bedside, waiting to catch me. As though his absence had not just been a moment, but the blueprint of my existence. I began to resent not only him, but also the pity. Pity is a heavier chain than anger. Anger at least fuels you. Pity leaves you powerless. At home, we rarely spoke of it. My father and I had fallen into a rhythm. He provided, I accepted. We danced around the crater of silence. My mother, meanwhile, was a gentle mediator. She seemed to carry her own unspoken sorrow, though at the time I mistook it for weariness. She would change the subject, pat my hand, remind me of homework or chores whenever I tried to probe too close. Looking back, I realized she was protecting him, or perhaps she was protecting me, from the weight of a truth too heavy for a teenage girl to hold. One evening in my junior year, I sat at the kitchen table, working on an essay about family legacy. The assignment was simple. Write about something significant your parents had passed down. I stared at the blank page until frustration boiled over. Finally, I wrote, "My father passed down silence." I handed in the paper the next day, and my teacher, Mrs. Caldwell, pulled me aside after class. "Sarah," she said softly, "is everything okay at home?" I nodded quickly, cheeks burning. "Of course. My dad just doesn't talk much." She hesitated, then squeezed my shoulder. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. I hated her for saying it because it felt like permission to keep resenting him. But deep down, I knew she was right. Silence had become the loudest member of our household. The community didn't help. Small towns are like echo chambers. One rumor bounces until it feels like truth. My father, stoic and reserved, became the man who wasn't there. It stuck to him like a label on a jar, no matter how many good deeds he stacked against it. He was at every parent-teacher conference. He built sets for the school play, even though I only had 3 lines. He cheered from the sidelines in weather that froze other parents in their cars. Still, the whisper persisted. Sometimes, I'd watch him standing alone at those events, shoulders squared against the quiet judgments he surely felt. He never argued, never explained, never sought to correct the record. He simply lived as though the whispers did not matter. But to me, they mattered. They mattered enough to shape the lens through which I saw him. College brought a strange mix of freedom and distance. At first, I thought I had escaped the shadow of that story. No one at university knew the gossip. To my new friends, I was just Sarah, smart, ambitious, maybe a little too intense. Yet the absence followed me. It had become part of how I defined myself. During late-night dorm conversations, when friends traded family stories, I would drop mine like a bitter jewel. My dad wasn't even there when I was born. Gasps, pity, sometimes outrage, always attention. And every time I said it, the canyon between us grew deeper. One Thanksgiving, my sophomore year, I came home and found my father in the garage, tinkering with the same truck he'd driven since I was 5. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. "Why don't you ever defend yourself?" I asked suddenly. He looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "You know what people say," I pressed. "They've said it my whole life, that you weren't there, that you left Mom. Don't you care what they think?" He studied me for a long moment, then turned back to his work. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the truth isn't for them. It's for you." I wanted to scream. "Then tell me," I demanded. But he only wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Not yet. Not yet." 2 words that felt like a prison sentence. There were other moments, too. Small fragments that haunted me later. Like the time I caught him staring at my mother across the dinner table, eyes filled with something unspoken. Or the way his hands sometimes trembled when he held a glass too long. Or how he always donated blood at the town drive every chance he got. At the time, I chalked it up to habit or duty or some stubborn desire to be useful. I never connected the dots. The breaking point came my senior year of college. I had just broken up with my boyfriend, a boy who had promised forever and delivered betrayal in less than a semester. I called home, sobbing. My mother answered, soothed me, then passed the phone to my father. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell me everything would be okay. He just said, "You'll heal because you come from strong blood." Strong blood. I thought it was just a phrase, a father's awkward attempt at comfort. I didn't realize then how literal those words were. By the time I graduated, the canyon had become routine. We loved each other from opposite sides, tossing gestures across the gap, care packages, phone calls, birthday dinners. But the silence remained, unbroken, a monument we both pretended not to see. It would take another few years, and one dusty box in the attic, before I finally uncovered the truth that had been waiting for me all along. But before that day, I lived with the burden of silence. And so did he. The truth of a life often hides in the places no one talks about. For me, it was hidden in a hospital corridor 28 years ago. I wasn't there to remember it, of course, but memory has a way of being passed down, not in words, but in silences, in the cracks of conversations, in the way someone looks away when a date comes up on the calendar. Over time, I pieced together fragments. A nurse's passing comment, my mother's nervous laugh, my father's unwillingness to speak. But it wasn't until much later that I discovered the whole of it, tucked inside yellowed papers in a cardboard box. This is how I've come to understand it. It was February 14, 1997, a Friday. Snow had fallen heavy the night before in Denver, the kind that muffled the world, made the roads a gamble. My mother was 8 months pregnant, already exhausted from a difficult pregnancy. She woke that morning with pain she tried to ignore until she couldn't anymore. My father rushed her to St. Mary's Hospital, driving through icy streets with white knuckles gripping the wheel. He parked crooked, left the keys in the ignition, and carried her inside. By then, she was bleeding badly. The doctor's words were stark, placental abruption, a term that meant the placenta had detached early, leaving both mother and baby in danger. The only solution was emergency delivery and fast. My father was told to wait outside while they prepped my mother. He paced the corridor, his boots squeaking against the linoleum, his breath fogging in the sterile air. He wasn't afraid of blood. He'd cut his hands 100 times at the machine shop, but this was different. This was the blood of his wife, his unborn child. Then came the twist of fate. The hospital's blood bank was nearly depleted of my mother's rare type, O negative. They had just enough for emergencies, but not enough for what she might need if the bleeding didn't stop. My father didn't hesitate. "Test me," he said. They did. He was a match. I imagined the moment he rolled up his sleeve. The fluorescent light above flickered. His arm, strong from years of work, trembled slightly as the needle slid in. He never told me any of this, but I've seen the papers. I've read the notes. He donated pint after pint, enough to stabilize her when she hemorrhaged during surgery. And while he lay in another room, pale and drained, I was born. The nurses carried me out, a squirming red bundle, and people noticed what wasn't there. A father at the glass, hands pressed, tears streaming. Instead, there was only an empty space. Empty spaces are dangerous. People fill them with stories. By the time my mother was stable and my father was able to stand again, the narrative had already taken root. Michael Bennett hadn't been there for his daughter's first breath. I think of that often now, the speed with which a story hardens into stone. The town didn't know about the blood shortage. They didn't know about the transfusion, the hours my father spent hooked up to a line that kept my mother alive. All they saw was absence, and absence is easier to judge than sacrifice is to explain. My mother tried at first, when her sisters clucked their tongues and said, "He wasn't even there." She would answer softly, "He was helping," but details were hard to give without breaking promises of confidentiality, and soon she grew tired of defending him. My father never defended himself at all. That was his way. He carried the truth quietly like a stone in his pocket. Heavy, yes, but his to bear. When I picture that day now, I try to see it from his eyes. The hallway stretching out like a tunnel, the sound of footsteps hurrying past, the call of his name when they told him he was a match, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the sting of the needle. His head swimming as blood drained into a bag meant for the woman he loved. He wasn't watching the miracle of life in a delivery room. He was giving part of himself so that miracle could exist at all. I sometimes wonder, if he had walked into that nursery afterward, if he had held me up against the glass, would the whispers have stopped? Or would people still have found something to question, some reason to doubt? Because sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the story people prefer to tell. Growing up, I thought my father's absence on the day of my birth was proof of weakness. Now I see it for what it was, proof of love. The kind of love that doesn't make speeches, doesn't show up in photographs, but lives in veins and marrow. When I finally found the hospital records years later, I cried until the ink blurred. There, in black and white, was the signature of my father, the typewritten note. Donor provided blood for transfusion, mother and infant stable. It was strange holding that paper. On one hand, it was a key that unlocked decades of misunderstanding. On the other, it was just paper. The truth had been there all along, not in ink, but in the man himself, in the lunches he packed, the cars he fixed, the quiet way he loved me. But back then, as a child, I didn't know. All I knew was the story people told, that he wasn't there, and stories, repeated enough, become cages. The morning after my birth, the hospital smelled like bleach and oranges, the kind of fruit volunteers handed out to patients to brighten the corridors. My mother lay pale against her pillow, a thin blanket tucked up to her chin. She had nearly died. Everyone in the room knew it, though no one said the words out loud. And my father, he sat by her bed, his face drawn, skin ashen from the blood he'd given. He held her hand, not letting go even when nurses bustled in and out. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't ask for thanks. He simply sat there, watching her breathe, watching me sleep in the bassinet beside her. When my mother finally opened her eyes, she whispered, "You saved us." He shook his head. "No, you did the hard part." That was him, always deflecting, always placing the weight somewhere else. He never told her how dizzy he had been, how the world had tilted when they drew more than 1 pint, how he had prayed silently that his body would hold out. He never told me either, and so the silence began. By the time we left the hospital, the story had already been written in the town's collective mind. Michael wasn't there when the baby came. Words are lighter than blood, but they travel farther. By the end of that week, neighbors knew. By the end of that month, cousins knew. And by the time I was old enough to toddle around church, the whisper had become gospel. People didn't mean to be cruel, not always. But pity has its own cruelty. Women would pat my mother's arm and say, "You're so strong," Linda raising her when he couldn't even show up that day. My mother would smile weakly, too tired to explain. My father would stand nearby, expression unreadable as if he hadn't heard. But he had. He always heard. And still he never defended himself. As I grew older, fragments of the truth appeared in small, almost accidental ways. One winter afternoon when I was 9, I walked in on my parents talking in the kitchen. My mother's voice was low, insistent. "She'll find out one day. Don't you think she deserves to know?" My father's reply was a whisper. "When she's ready." I froze in the hallway, not knowing what they meant. I only caught the way my mother sighed, the way my father rubbed his forehead like a man carrying a burden too heavy to put down. I padded back to my room, angry without knowing why. Children often sense what is unsaid more than what is spoken. There were other signs. At every blood drive, my father rolled up his sleeve without hesitation. He would sit quietly, watching the crimson fill the bag, his eyes far away. Once, a nurse commented, "You must have been doing this a long time." My father just nodded. I didn't realize then that he had been doing it since the day I was born. That maybe each donation was a quiet ritual of remembrance. In high school biology, we learned about blood types. O negative, the universal donor. The teacher explained how rare it was, how valuable. I raised my hand, curious. "My mom's O negative. Lucky," the teacher said. "It can save anyone." I turned to look at my father that evening at dinner. He was sipping coffee, flipping through the newspaper. Did he know that? Of course he did. I didn't ask. By then, I'd already learned that questions about my birth were swallowed by silence. The cruel irony is that while he gave blood to keep me alive, I used words to wound him. Words like, "You weren't there." Words like, "You don't care." I remember one argument vividly. I was 17, furious after another round of gossip at school. I confronted him in the living room, fists clenched. "Why can't you just admit it?" I shouted. "You didn't show up. You left Mom alone." He looked at me, pain flickering across his face, but he said nothing. He simply shook his head and walked out to the porch. I thought his silence was cowardice. I didn't know it was love, that he would rather carry my anger than burden me with a truth I wasn't ready to hold. The truth lived in paper instead. Years later, when I was 23, I came home for Thanksgiving. My mother asked me to bring down some boxes from the attic. I dragged one into the light, coughing on dust. Inside, I found hospital forms, faded, edges curled. One caught my eye. Donor Michael Bennett, O negative. Transfusion administered to patient, Linda Bennett. Infant delivered, stable. I stared at it, my hands trembling. The room tilted as if my whole life had been resting on a crooked foundation and someone had finally kicked it out from under me. He hadn't abandoned me. He had saved me. Saved us both. I sat on the attic floor for hours, papers spread around me like puzzle pieces. In those records, I found what my father had never said, the exact volume of blood he'd given, the times the nurses had logged, the note about his dizziness. Every line was proof of sacrifice, and I cried hot, ashamed tears that blurred the ink, because all those years I had judged him. I had let the town judge him. I had turned his silence into my weapon. It was then that I realized the danger of stories. Not the ones that are lies outright, but the ones that are half true. He wasn't there when I was born, that part was true. But the story around it was wrong. And sometimes, the wrong story is worse than a lie, because it feels close enough to believe. When I finally came downstairs, my father was sitting in his chair, reading as always. He looked up, smiled faintly. "You find what you needed?" he asked. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, throat tight, the papers still clutched in my hands. He didn't ask what I'd read, he already knew. He had been waiting for this moment, perhaps my whole life, and all he said was, "Now you understand." From that day, I began to see him differently. The lines on his face weren't just age, they were maps of battles fought in silence. The quiet way he moved through the world wasn't emptiness, it was humility. I had spent years resenting the absence of one moment while ignoring the presence of a lifetime. And slowly, the canyon between us began to close. They say a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth laces up its shoes. In a small town, it doesn't need to travel far. It just slips across a neighbor's fence, down the church pew, over a checkout counter. By the time I was old enough to walk, the story of my father's absence had already grown legs, and it followed us everywhere. At first, I didn't know what the whispers meant. Children are intuitive but not fluent in innuendo. I just felt it, the way adults lowered their voices when we entered a room, the way they turned polite smiles toward my father but their eyes flicked elsewhere, judgment flickering like candlelight. When I was 6, at a birthday party for a girl in our neighborhood, I overheard 2 mothers speaking. One said, "Can you imagine, not even there for the birth?" The other clicked her tongue. Poor Linda, she deserved better. I didn't fully understand, but I understood enough to feel shame burn hot in my chest. I tugged on my dress, wishing it were armor. My father was across the yard, helping string up balloons. He didn't hear them, or maybe he pretended not to. Pretending was his gift. That was the beginning of my education. Not in school, but in the harsh curriculum of perception. By middle school, I had learned the contours of the rumor. My father was painted as unreliable, cowardly, maybe even selfish. None of it matched the man who fixed my bicycle chain at dawn or who brought me hot chocolate after a snowstorm. But children don't compare stories to facts. They compare them to survival. And survival in middle school meant blending in. One afternoon in the cafeteria, a boy shouted, "Hey, Sarah, did your dad ever show up for you, or is he still hiding?" The table erupted in laughter. I froze, tray trembling in my hands. I don't remember what I answered. Maybe I laughed, maybe I stayed silent. What I do remember is the way their eyes sparkled with satisfaction, as if they had uncovered some grand weakness in me. Children sense where the wound is, and they press until it bleeds. When I came home that night, I told no one. I simply went to my room and wrote in my diary. If he had just been there, none of this would happen, as if his absence were the single domino that tipped over my childhood. If anyone could have defended him, it was my mother. But she stayed quiet. I used to think it was indifference. Now I see it was exhaustion. How many times can a woman repeat the truth before it begins to sound like begging? At church potlucks, her friends would lean close, voices dripping with sympathy. "You were so strong that day." She would nod, smile politely, and refill their cups. She never said, "Actually, Michael was the reason I survived." She let them think what they wanted. Sometimes after those gatherings, I would find her sitting in the kitchen alone, staring into her tea as if it held answers. "Mom," I'd ask. She'd blink, smile, and say, "I'm fine." But fine is a word people use to cover cracks, and ours were spreading. My father bore it differently. He didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't try to set the record straight. He carried the weight of other people's eyes like a man who had decided long ago that his own truth was enough. I remember once, during a 4th of July picnic, a neighbor half-jokingly said, "Mike, you couldn't even face the delivery room, huh?" Everyone chuckled, expecting him to laugh along. Instead, he simply sipped his lemonade and said, "Some things matter more than being seen." Then he stood, walked over to help a child untangle a kite string, leaving the laughter to die in the grass. At the time, I thought he was weak. Later, I realized it was strength, the kind that doesn't need applause. But as a teenager, I didn't see strength. I saw humiliation. Every whisper felt like proof that he had failed me, and because he never defended himself, I assumed the story must be true. In high school, when friends compared family stories, I would shrug and say, "My dad wasn't there when I was born." Sometimes they gasped, sometimes they pitied me, sometimes they moved on quickly. But each reaction was another brick in the wall between us. I began to resent his quiet presence. He was always there, driving me to practice, fixing the sink, sitting in the bleachers. And yet I treated him like absence made flesh. There were nights I shouted at him. Why don't you just admit you failed? He would lower his eyes, take a slow breath, and whisper, not every story is ready to be told. Those words enraged me. I wanted noise, not silence, confession, not riddles. When I left for college, I thought I had escaped the rumor. No one there knew. I could reinvent myself, free from the ghost of a story told in a small town. But freedom is not forgetting. In late-night dorm conversations, when friends asked about family, I would offer my practice line. My dad wasn't there when I was born. It was my inheritance, the one piece of family lore I felt sure about. And even as I said it, part of me hoped the pity in their eyes would justify the anger in mine. The truth, folded quietly in an attic box, remained unknown to me. My father, across hundreds of miles, still carried it alone. Looking back, I see how relentless the community's judgment was. It wasn't just one whisper, it was a lifetime of them. At grocery stores, poor Sarah, her dad wasn't there. At school events, Linda's strong, raising her like that. At weddings and funerals, some men just can't handle pressure. Everywhere, the same verdict, guilty. And because I grew up in that echo chamber, I believed it. Their words became the lens through which I saw my own father. What I didn't understand was this. When you let other people tell your story, you end up living inside their version of it. And I lived in theirs for far too long. The irony is almost unbearable. While the world painted him as absent, he had been more present than anyone could imagine. His blood ran in my veins. His sacrifice had bought me my first breath. And yet, all I knew was the absence. He never corrected me, never sat me down to reveal the truth. Instead, he let me carry my resentment, believing perhaps that I would be stronger for it when the truth finally came. I used to think the cruelty of the town had broken him. Now I see it was me. My words, my accusations, my cold shoulders. He could endure the community's judgment. What pierced him were the doubts in my eyes. And still, he stayed. Still, he fixed my car, packed my lunches, waited in the parking lot after late practices. Still, he loved me in silence. That is the paradox of my father. He was criticized for absence, but his entire life was presence. The misunderstanding lasted decades. It shaped my childhood, my teenage years, even my adulthood. It created distance where there should have been closeness, suspicion where there should have been trust. And yet, through it all, my father never wavered. He bore the weight of other people's eyes, and even the weight of mine, because he knew the truth would outlast the rumor. It took me years to realize that strength is not always loud, and love is not always obvious. Sometimes strength is quiet endurance, and love is the choice to carry a burden so someone else doesn't have to. The town may have judged him harshly, but I judged him worse. And in the end, the only eyes that mattered were mine. A lie in a small town does not need wings, it only needs ears. And our town had plenty of them. By the time I was old enough to understand words, the story about my father had already been told so many times it was practically carved into the sidewalks. He wasn't there when I was born. He left my mother alone. He failed the very first test of fatherhood. That was the tale people chose to carry, and they carried it like a hymn, soft on the lips, easy to hum, impossible to forget. I grew up learning the story not through lectures, but through glances. A tilt of a neighbor's head when we walked by, a hush in the grocery aisle, a smile that came just a little too late. I absorbed it like second-hand smoke. At 6, I didn't understand what it meant to miss a birth. At 6, all I knew was that people pitied me, and pity felt like a bruise I couldn't point to. I would tug at my dress at birthday parties, hoping fabric could hide the shame I didn't yet have words for. When I was 9, I overheard 2 women at church whispering while they poured coffee. "Poor Linda," one said. "She had to do it all by herself." The other nodded gravely, as if reciting scripture. Some men just don't have the courage. My mother walked by then, balancing a tray of muffins. They smiled at her, wide and sweet, the way people smile when they think they're being kind. She smiled back, though her eyes dimmed in a way only I noticed. At that moment, I wanted to grab her hand and demand she tell them the truth, shout it across the fellowship hall, make them swallow their judgment. But she didn't. She never did. My mother's silence was its own language when I mistook for surrender. My father bore it differently. He had a quietness to him, but it wasn't the weak kind. It was a quietness like stone, hard, steady, unyielding. At a 4th of July picnic, when a neighbor nudged him and joked, "You couldn't handle the delivery room, huh?" The group chuckled, waiting for him to join. He sipped his lemonade, wiped his mouth, and said, "Some things matter more than being seen." Then he walked away to untangle a child's kite string. I watched him go, burning with anger. To me, his silence felt like confession. If he didn't deny it, wasn't it true? By middle school, the rumor became a weapon. Kids are cruel, not because they're born that way, but because cruelty is a quick path to power. One boy, Marcus, shouted across the cafeteria, "Did your dad skip your birthday too, Sarah?" Laughter echoed around me, bouncing off the linoleum walls. I laughed too because laughter was armor, but the words hit me all the same. That night, I slammed my door so hard the frame shook. My father knocked once, softly, then walked away when I didn't answer. He respected closed doors, even when what was behind them was a bleeding child. The older I grew, the sharper the judgment became. In high school, a teacher once said, "You're resilient, Sarah. Kids without present fathers usually struggle, but look at you." I bit my tongue. I wanted to shout that he was present in every way that counted, driving me to practice, fixing my laptop at midnight, sitting in the stands during my games. But the shadow of that one moment, the absence at my birth, eclipsed everything else. It was as if the town had frozen him in time, condemned forever to that empty space outside the delivery room. I didn't help. In fact, I sharpened the knife. At sleepovers, when friends traded family stories, I would shrug and say, "My dad wasn't there when I was born." I said it bitterly, like a badge of tragedy, and their gasps and pity only fed the narrative I had come to believe. Each retelling widened the canyon between us. My father's quiet love, the lunches packed with notes on napkins, the way he scraped ice from my windshield before I woke for school, faded behind the spotlight of that single story. We fought more as I grew older. One evening when I was 17, I stormed into the living room, furious after another whisper at school. "Why don't you just admit it?" I shouted. "You weren't there, you left Mom alone." He looked up from his book, pain flickering in his eyes. For a moment I thought he might finally explain, finally give me the truth I craved. But he only set the book aside, rubbed his forehead, and whispered, "Not every story is ready to be told." I hated those words. I wanted noise, confession, not riddles. I slammed out the door, convinced his silence was cowardice. I didn't know it was love. College gave me freedom, but not peace. No one there knew the rumor, so I could reinvent myself. Yet, when conversations turned to family, I offered my practice line. "My dad wasn't there when I was born." It rolled off my tongue easily, like a script I had memorized. My friends reacted with pity, sometimes outrage, and each reaction justified the anger I carried. The truth was folded in a box back home, gathering dust while I performed the half-story again and again. The town didn't let go of it either. At grocery stores, I overheard. Poor Sarah, her dad wasn't even there. At weddings, Linda's strong, raising her like that. At funerals, some men just can't handle the pressure. It was relentless, a background hum to my life. Even when my father helped a neighbor fix their roof, even when he shoveled snow from an elderly widow's driveway, even when he showed up for every event in my life, still, he was the man who wasn't there. The cruelest part is how easily I believed them. I looked at him through their eyes instead of my own. I saw absence instead of sacrifice, weakness instead of strength. I judged him the way they judged him, and in doing so, I became part of his burden. He could endure the whispers of neighbors. What broke him, I think, were the doubts in his daughter's eyes. And yet, he stayed. Through every accusation, every slammed door, every silence between us, he stayed. He drove me to campus when I left for college, loading boxes into the back of his truck with methodical care. He stood in my dorm room doorway, hands rough, eyes tired, and said, "You'll do fine, call your mother." He didn't say call me. I didn't ask him why. We kept to our choreography, step close, step back, bow out. What I didn't see then, what I only see now, is that his entire life was presence. He fixed what broke, he gave what he could, he stayed when it was hard. He lived under the weight of other people's eyes, under the shadow of a rumor, and still he chose to love quietly. The town may have judged him harshly, but I judged him worse. And through it all, he bore it with a patience I mistook for apathy. For years, I lived inside their story of him, not the truth. That is the danger of gossip. It gives you a cage that looks like home. You walk in willingly, decorate the bars with your own resentment, and convince yourself it's the whole world. But the truth, messy, hidden, inconvenient, waits outside, patient as stone. It would take me decades to realize that the absence everyone condemned was the very thing that had saved me. But before that revelation, before the papers in the attic, I carried the rumor like a scar. And so did he. The attic was never meant to hold answers. It was a place for Christmas decorations, old winter coats, and boxes no one had the heart to open. Yet that Thanksgiving, when my mother asked me to bring down some linens from the top shelf, I found myself kneeling on the wooden planks, staring at cardboard boxes stacked like forgotten gravestones. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the shaft of light from the small round window. I tugged at one box labeled Misk, in my father's blocky handwriting. It collapsed slightly under my grip, spilling papers across the floor. I cursed under my breath, brushing dust from my jeans as I gathered them. Most were ordinary tax receipts, instruction manuals, a yellowed warranty for a refrigerator long gone. But one folder, thinner than the rest, caught my eye. It was stamped St. Mary's Hospital, February 14, 1997. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were medical forms typed and signed, the ink faded but legible. My mother's name appeared on several sheets, her patient number, the diagnosis, placental abruption. I squinted at the sterile language, my heart thudding. Then on one form I saw my father's name. Donor Michael Bennett, O negative. Transfusion administered, 2 units. Patient stable. Infant stable. I read it once, twice. A third time as if repetition would carve the truth deeper into me. The words blurred with tears. I had carried anger for so long, anger that had shaped me, that had seeped into the cracks of my adolescence, that had colored every memory of him. And here in my hands was the undoing of it all. He hadn't abandoned us. He had saved us. I sank onto the floorboards, papers spread around me like fragile wings. The dust swirled as if the room itself exhaled. 23 years of misunderstanding pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. My father's silence, my mother's evasion, the whispers of the town, all of it had built a wall between us. And yet the truth had been here all along, waiting patiently in a box. I don't know how long I sat there. At some point, my mother's voice drifted up the stairs, calling if I had found the linens. I shoved the folder back into the box, clutching one paper in my hand like contraband, and stumbled down the steps. When I reached the kitchen, my father was at the table, glasses perched on his nose, reading the newspaper. He looked up, smiled faintly, the way he always did when I walked into a room. His smile faltered when he saw my face. "You okay, kid?" he asked. I held out the paper with shaking hands. "What is this?" His eyes flicked to the page, then back to me. He took off his glasses slowly, folding them with care. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for me to sit. I dropped into the chair opposite him, my chest tight. You gave blood that day. For Mom. For me." He nodded once. "Yes. Why didn't you ever tell me?" My voice cracked, rising higher than I intended. All those years, Dad, do you know what people said? Do you know what I thought? He set the glasses on the table, folded his hands. His voice was quiet, steady. I knew what they said, I heard it too. Then why didn't you defend yourself? My tears spilled, hot and furious. Why did you let everyone believe? Let me believe you weren't there because you didn't care. For a long moment he said nothing. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, part sorrow, part relief, part something softer. Finally he spoke. Because it didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was that you and your mother lived. That's not enough, I shouted. It mattered to me. His shoulders sagged. I know. He reached across the table, but I flinched back. He let his hand fall, nodding as if he deserved the rejection. I thought, when the time was right, you'd understand, but maybe I should have told you sooner. The next hours blurred. My mother joined us, startled to see the paper on the table, her eyes filling when she realized what had happened. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching, their silence heavy with years of unspoken truth. I begged him to tell you, she whispered, but he said it would only confuse you when you were young. And later it felt too late. The rumor had grown too big. I buried my face in my hands. All those years I hated you, I thought you abandoned us. My father's voice broke just slightly. I know. The truth should have been a bomb, but at first it was fire. It seared through me, leaving scars of regret. Every cruel word I had thrown at him, every cold shoulder, every moment I let the town's gossip harden into my belief. It all came rushing back. And he had borne it quietly, never asking for vindication, never demanding love in return. That night, I lay awake in my old bedroom, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed every memory, now tinted with new light. The lunches he packed, the way he scraped snow from my windshield, the long drives to soccer games. They weren't attempts to make up for absence. They were continuations of the sacrifice he had begun the day I was born. He had given blood then, and he had kept giving in every small way since. I thought about the countless times I had retold the rumor at college, turning his silence into my punchline. Shame twisted inside me. I wanted to run back through every conversation, every whispered judgment, and shout the truth. He was there. He was there in the only way that mattered. But time doesn't work that way. Once spoken, words can't be gathered. They float, they multiply, they cling to people's minds like burrs. My father had known that. He had lived under that weight, choosing to stay silent because he believed silence was stronger than argument. And maybe it was. The next morning, I found him in the garage, tinkering with his truck. I stood in the doorway watching him. His hands were steady, though his hair was grayer than I remembered, his shoulders heavier. Dad, I said. He looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, mourning. I hesitated, then blurted out, I'm sorry. He tilted his head. For what? For not knowing, for not believing, for every time I thought the worst of you. He set the rag down, walked over, and placed a hand on my shoulder. His eyes were gentle, tired, but warm. You don't have to be sorry, you didn't know. But I should have, I whispered. I should have trusted you. He shook his head. Trust isn't given, Sarah, it's built, and I didn't build it well enough, that's on me. I broke then, sobs shaking me, and for the first time in years I let him hold me. His arms were strong, steady, the same arms that had once given blood to save me. The days that followed were different. The air between us felt lighter, though the years of silence still lingered like ghosts. I noticed things I had ignored before, the way he whistled softly when he worked, the way he lingered at the dinner table to listen rather than speak, the way his eyes softened whenever they met mine. The truth hadn't erased the past, but it had rewritten it. Where once I saw absence, I now saw sacrifice. Where once I saw weakness, I now saw strength. And for the first time, I realized the depth of my father's love. Not loud, not showy, but steady, enduring, carved into the marrow of who he was. That box in the attic changed everything. It was more than paper. It was proof, yes, but also invitation. an invitation to see him not through the eyes of a town that loved gossip, not through the eyes of a child who felt abandoned, but through the eyes of truth. And once you see truth, you cannot unsee it. The days after I found the hospital papers blurred into one long stretch of quiet reckoning. It was as if every breath in our house was slower, heavier, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the shift in truth. I couldn't stop carrying the paper with me. It sat folded in my pocket, then tucked under my pillow, then back on the kitchen table. Sometimes I would open it just to trace my father's name, written in black ink nearly 3 decades ago. I wanted to memorize it, to etch into myself the evidence of what had been hidden for so long. For years, I had thought my father's silence was proof of his absence. Now I realized it had been the opposite. His silence was protection. And protection, though born of love, had grown into a wedge that divided us. I had let other people's stories write my heart. Now, for the first time, I wanted to hear his own. So one evening, after the dishes were done and my mother had gone upstairs early, I found him on the back porch. He sat in his usual chair, the one with the armrest worn smooth from years of use, looking out at the yard as if the silence between us could be measured in blades of grass. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I hesitated in the doorway, clutching the screen with one hand. "Dad," I said softly. He turned, his face gentle but guarded. "Hey, kid, can we talk?" He nodded, motioning to the chair beside him. I sat, pulling my knees up slightly, like I had when I was a child seeking comfort. For a long time, we just listened to the night, the crickets, the faint hum of traffic on the highway. Finally, I pulled the folded paper from my pocket and laid it on the armrest between us. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected, though my hands shook. He looked at the paper without touching it. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry decades of weight. "Because I didn't want your first story of life to be about death." That day was messy, scary, full of things a child shouldn't have to carry. You deserve to grow up free of that burden. But I didn't grow up free, I said quickly, the words tumbling out. I grew up believing you abandoned me. I grew up hearing whispers that you weren't strong enough, that you didn't care. Do you know what that does to a daughter? His jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw pain etched there, raw and naked. I know, I heard the whispers too, every word. I carried them. Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you set the record straight? My voice broke on the edge of anger and grief. He turned toward me fully, his eyes shining in the dim porch light. Because sometimes, Sarah, truth isn't about winning an argument. It's about living in a way that proves it. I figured, if I was there for you every day, if I showed up, if I loved you right, you would see who I really was. I thought that would be enough. I swallowed hard, my throat aching. It wasn't. I needed to hear it. I needed to know. He nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. You're right, I should have told you. I just didn't want to make that day about me. It was supposed to be about you, about your mother. I didn't want to stand in the story like some kind of hero. I just did what I had to do. The simplicity of his words undid me. Tears spilled down my cheeks, hot and relentless. I hated you, I whispered. For so many years, I hated you for something you never even did. He reached over then, his rough hand covering mine. His grip was steady, warm. You don't owe me anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding. I only ever wanted you safe. I leaned into him then, for the first time in what felt like decades, letting the years of anger melt into his shoulder. He held me, not tightly, but firmly enough to anchor me. And in that embrace, I felt the truth more deeply than any paper could prove. My father had been there all along, in ways the world chose not to see. The following Sunday, my mother insisted on making a big family dinner. She moved about the kitchen with unusual energy, as though the meal itself could stitch us back together. She roasted a chicken, mashed potatoes, set out the good dishes we usually reserved for holidays. I helped her set the table, noticing how her hands shook slightly when she placed the silverware. When we sat down, the conversation was stilted at first. Weather, work, the neighbor's new puppy. But halfway through the meal, my mother put down her fork and looked between us. "It's time," she said. My father glanced at her, then back at his plate. "Time for what?" "For people to know," she said firmly. "I've kept quiet all these years because you asked me to, but Sarah deserves to live in a world where the truth isn't a secret, and so do you." His eyes darkened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded slowly. I held my breath. "You mean telling everyone?" "Yes," my mother said. "Your aunts, your cousins, the neighbors, whoever will listen. They've judged long enough. They should know what really happened." My father exhaled, long and tired. "I never needed them to know. But I do," I said quietly. "I need them to stop looking at you the way they do. I need them to see you the way I do now." For the first time, a faint smile flickered on his face. "And how's that?" "As a man who gave everything he had," I whispered. He reached for his glass of water, blinking rapidly, and I realized he was holding back tears. My father, the man of stone, the man of silence, undone by a daughter's words. The truth spread slowly, like dawn creeping over a horizon. My mother began with her sisters, telling them over coffee in the kitchen. At first they blinked, confused, then ashamed, as though decades of gossip had suddenly curdled in their mouths. Word reached the church, the neighbors, the small network of people who had carried the old story for years. Some offered awkward apologies. Some simply grew quiet, avoiding our eyes. For me, the shift was seismic. People who had once looked at my father with pity or contempt now looked at him with something closer to reverence. But my father never basked in it. He kept on living as he always had, fixing the truck, helping neighbors, sipping his coffee in silence. When someone tried to thank him, he brushed it off. "I just did what anyone would do," he'd say. But I knew better. Not everyone would have done what he did. Not everyone would have given blood until their body was weak. Not everyone would have carried decades of misunderstanding without complaint. That kind of love was rare. That kind of strength was almost invisible, until it wasn't. One evening, a few weeks later, I stood in the town library where I had once hidden from whispers. My father had come with me to help carry books for a project. As we walked out, an older woman approached us. She had been one of the loudest voices years ago, repeating the rumor with relish. She stopped him now, her hands twisting nervously. "Michael," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." He looked at her kindly as if she were a child caught in a mistake. No apology needed, but she insisted. "I judged you. I told everyone you weren't there. I didn't know the truth." He nodded. "That's the thing about truth, it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits." We walked away and I slipped my hand into his. For the first time, I wasn't ashamed. For the first time, I wanted the world to see us together. The reconciliation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single speech or a grand revelation. It was smaller than that, quieter. It was in the way we lingered at the dinner table now, in the way I called him just to ask about his day, in the way he answered without hesitation. It was in laughter that returned slowly, like grass growing back after a long winter, and it was in the way I finally began to tell the story correctly. Not my dad wasn't there when I was born, but my dad was there in the only way that mattered. He gave blood so I could live. That story, once spoken, felt like healing. Each time I told it, the old wound closed a little more. Each time, my father's eyes softened with quiet gratitude, as though he hadn't expected me to carry his truth as my own. We never erased the years of misunderstanding. They remained, like scars do, faint but undeniable. But scars are proof of healing, not just of pain. And in those days, as winter turned to spring, I began to see my father not as the man the town had painted, not even as the man I had once resented, but as the man he truly was, steady, humble, extraordinary in his ordinariness. I had spent so long living in other people's stories. Now, finally, I was living in his, And in mine, the story of my father is not the story I thought I had been given. For most of my life, I carried a version told by whispers, shaped by silence, sharpened by my own resentment. That version was heavy, almost unbearable, and it bent the way I saw him, the way I saw myself. Now, standing in the light of truth, I see how fragile that version was, how easily it fell apart once the truth finally stepped forward. My father never asked for vindication. He never asked for recognition or thanks or even forgiveness. He simply lived quietly each day building a life around us. The irony is that the town, for years, mistook that very quietness as proof of guilt. They looked at his silence and saw cowardice. I looked at it and saw abandonment, but what it really was, what it had always been, was love. A love too deep to need applause, a love too humble to demand acknowledgement. When I walk through town now, people see him differently. They nod with respect, some with shame in their eyes for having carried the old rumor. They offer words of apology, and he accepts them with the same calm patience he has carried all his life. But I know the truth. He doesn't need their apologies. He had already forgiven them long before they thought to ask. I think about forgiveness a lot these days. Not theirs, but mine. For years, I let myself be defined by a wound that wasn't real. For years, I sharpened my tongue against my own father. I told the half-story like a parable of failure, not realizing it was a parable of sacrifice. I look back on those moments now, the slammed doors, the cold shoulders, the words I hurled at him, and I feel a pang of guilt that sometimes keeps me awake at night. But then I remember the way he looked at me when I finally said I was sorry, the way he held me like nothing had been lost, and I understand that forgiveness had always been waiting for me. He had already given me life. Of course, he would give me forgiveness, too. Sometimes I imagine what it must have been like that day, the fluorescent lights of the hospital, the panic of nurses rushing, my mother's pale face, the sting of a needle piercing my father's arm. I imagine his head spinning, his body weakening as blood left him. I imagine the moment I entered the world while he lay in another room, too dizzy to stand, his sacrifice invisible to all but a handful of doctors. I imagine him hearing the first cries of his daughter from a distance, not able to be there, and yet knowing, deep in his bones, that without what he had done, those cries would never have existed at all. That is the moment I want to carry with me, not the rumor, not the whispers, but the truth of a man giving everything so his wife and child could live. That is the legacy he has left me. I tell this story now not only because it belongs to me, but because it might belong to you too. Maybe you've carried a half story about someone you love. Maybe you've judged them by what you didn't understand, or let the voices of others drown out your own. Maybe you've looked at silence and seen absence when what it really was, what it always might have been, was love in disguise. If that's you, I hope you'll look again. I hope you'll knock on the door you've left closed for too long. I hope you'll give space for the truth to breathe. Because sometimes, the people we think have failed us are the very ones who have saved us quietly without ever asking for credit. As for me, I no longer tell the old story. When people ask about my father, I don't say, "He wasn't there." I say, "He was there in the only way that mattered. He gave blood so that I could live, and then he spent the rest of his life giving in smaller ways that mattered just as much." And when I look at him now, older, slower, hair grayer at the temples, I don't see absence anymore. I see a man who carried the weight of misunderstanding with dignity. I see a man who chose silence over self-defense because he believed his love would speak louder. I see a man who taught me that strength isn't always about standing in the spotlight. It's about standing firm in the shadows, steady and unshaken until the truth is ready to be seen. This is my father's story, and it is mine too. To those of you who have listened all the way to the end, thank you. Stories like these are not easy to tell, but they matter. Because somewhere out there, Someone is living under the weight of the wrong story. If this touched you, I hope you carry it with you, not just as a tale of my father, but as a reminder of your own family, your own quiet heroes. I wish you health, peace, and happiness with the people you love. May your families be safe. May your hearts be gentle. May your homes be filled with the kind of love that doesn't always need to be spoken. And if this story meant something to you, if you felt even a little of what I felt writing it, I'd be grateful if you stayed with me for more. Click subscribe, not as a favor, but as a way of saying these stories matter, that love, sacrifice, and family still deserve to be told. From my family to yours, thank you and take care.